I don't know if you've ever wondered where in the world you're going. I have been at several times in my life wondering where in the world am I going? Not where in the world is Carmen Sandiego. Yeah, you might recognize the graphic. But where are we going? What are we doing? What's coming next? There was a period several years ago, I was on staff at a large Baptist church, and I was doing all the youth ministry there, and we had taken the kids on a mission trip to Mexico. And, Mexico, it's a foreign country, but it's close. We drove down to the border, stayed with my parents who lived in El Paso, and put our trailer and things that we'd traveled with at the church where they were at, and then drove just across the border to Juarez, Mexico, and did about a week or so of missions there. It was a great trip. It went well. And a lot of the kids and the parents in the church were like, this is phenomenal. We're taking our kids on mission. We're going to foreign countries. Let's do a bigger trip. In 2007, let's plan an international mission trip. And the Southern Baptists had a branch that handled international mission trips for youth groups and called International World Changers. And they had spots where missionaries around the world were calling for hundreds of kids to come during the summer and help with summer ministries. And so we're like, let's do it. 2007. They've got 4 different areas that we could go to, different trips that we could go on. And I looked at the list and went, well, this is a no-brainer. One of those trips is to Russia. And Pam and I had lived there for years. We knew the language and the culture and had so many connections and people. And we thought, clearly, this is the year they're doing a trip to Russia. This is the trip that our church needs to go on. And it just made perfect sense to me. And so we laid out the different possibilities of the trips and said, now there are several, but one of the trips is to Russia, and it's just been a few years since we were there, and we're going to be leading the trip anyway, and the culture, the language, the airports, the travel, trains from Moscow to the city where we're working. It's like, we know how to handle all that. It'll be a perfect trip for the church. And the parents are like, no, we don't want to send our kids to Russia. I'm like, no, it'll be phenomenal. The doors are open right now. Let's go while we can, and it'll be an amazing cross-culture experience for your kids. And we don't want our kids going to Russia. That's just, the concept of that was just being honest, like, well, where do you want them to go? They're like, well, the trip to Greece. I'm like, we can't take a mission trip to Greece during the summer and be on the coast. How are we going to raise funds for that? We want to go spend the summer in Greece and the Mediterranean, and we're going to be missionaries. I'm like, that just won't work. And so I remember thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? We've got to have parents involved. We've got to have adults who are going to go on the trip. We've got to have kids who are going to go on the trip. And the fundraising is going to be a church-wide effort. I wrestled with it, and I thought, Lord, I don't know where you want us to go. This needs to be a decision I leave up to the kids and their parents. I need to leave this up to the youth group. Whatever they decide, that's what we decide. But I just knew in my heart it had to be Russia. That just so made sense to me. It was amazing. It was perfect. So we presented all the different information. We had meetings with the parents and the kids and others from the church. And the final decision came in. We're going to Greece. And I thought, this is just so wrong. They missed the will of God. It was so obvious we were supposed to go to Russia. But God sent us to Greece. And so 2007, I find myself and Pam in Philippi, the archaeological site in Greece. The trip itself was to the city of Thessalonica. We spent a week doing ministry all throughout the city of Thessalonica. It's one of those ancient cities that from Bible times to the present, probably because it's a postal city or a coastal city and a great port, it has been populated for 2,000 years. Philippi is in ruins. Philippi sits outside of all the other cities, and it's just an archaeological site. But there were several other adults that went on the trip with the kids, and I realized, and so I coordinated this. I'm like, so at the end of the mission trip, Pam and I can go with the group back to the airport. We'll make sure all of the kids get on the airplane. They've got 4 other adults with them going on the plane. It's a direct flight back to the States, to JFK. They'll be fine. We can take an extra week and tour Greece, and we can go to biblical sites in Greece. So that's what we did. And it was a great week of ministry. We get the kids back on, and then Pam and I are going to go visit sites. So in preparation for that trip, 2007, I'm like, well, I got to study the cities that we're going to visit. And so I began to study the city of Philippi. And we got to go there, and we got to walk literally where Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke walked. And we got to go throughout the city there on the Ignatian Way, that ancient Roman road that goes. Do you like my hat? Do you like that's my little travel hat there? It's okay. Pam didn't like it either, but I liked it. So the ancient theater there in Philippi and the city and the sights, and it was just amazing to us. But even more than that, what I never knew in my own heart, what I could not have conceived of, I did not want to go on that trip. That is not the ministry I thought God had in store for us. It made perfect sense in every other way for us to take the trip to Russia with the kids, but that's not what was chosen. And so as a home base and traveling out from there, we ended up spending 2 weeks in the city of Thessalonica. And as I studied and prepared in 2007 for time in Thessalonica and getting the kids ready for the trip, began to read and to study and apply myself to getting us as prepared as we could and reading the background of the Thessalonian experience that Paul and Silas and Timothy had and reading his letters to the Thessalonian church. And then got to spend hours sitting in the ancient forum. It's been uncovered. They've gotten back to the first century forum is the Latin word. The Greek word would be the agora, the marketplace. Where Paul said in Philippians 2, I worked tirelessly night and day so that I would not be a burden to any of you. And he sat there as a tent maker in this marketplace, on this ground, on these stones. And I sat there for hours and pondered the experiences. And as I began to read, God began to open something up in me that I did not plan, that I did not expect. It was nowhere on our radar. But as I studied some of what seems like conflicting information between Acts 17, which is coming up, and the letters to the Thessalonians, I found there's in the theological world, there's a problem. There's a disagreement among scholars about what actually happened there. And that for the first time where the idea was sparked, where the concept was sparked to me that further study needs to be done on this. And I'm fascinated by what's going on and began in those days in 2007 with no idea what else was to come. Reading and studying. 10 years later, in a PhD program, God would have me write a dissertation, 500 pages on the Thessalonian background and the events of Paul and Silas there. I never planned on going there. I didn't want to go there. I thought that was the wrong choice. God opened something entirely new in my life, in our life, in our family, because of choices that really depended on other people much more than myself. We've come to Acts 16 and discovered this is a church nobody wants. This is a trip nobody wanted to go on. Paul didn't want to go to Philippi. Silas wasn't headed for Philippi. Timothy had no concept of going to Philippi. That was not the trip they had planned. They had spent weeks and months trying to go somewhere else. The Spirit of God had driven them to the city of Troas on the coast, and from there, they get a vision to go to Philippi and to found a church that nobody wanted, nobody expected. We'll read that for the most part, the city doesn't want the church there. The Philippian people don't want the church there. They don't want Paul and Silas in town. They're going to beat them and throw them in jail. But God had a plan for Philippi. And over the next decades, God is going to use that church in Philippi as the primary support network for Paul and the rest of his missionary journeys and ministry. And it's a church nobody wanted. We find ourselves in Acts chapter 16, verses 11 through 15. We go into Philippi now. We're going to look at some of the new characters, new stories. It's like a whole new season of Acts. The new episodes have dropped on Netflix. You can go and meet guys like Luke and a woman like Lydia that you've never met before. And there's new storylines and plots. So here we go. Acts 16, 11 to 15. Therefore, putting out to sea from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and on the next following day to Neapolis. And most of us are like, it's maps, it's names, it means nothing to me, let's move on. We'll come back. And from there to Philippi, which is the leading city of the district of Macedonia, a Roman colony. And we were staying in the city for some days. Luke mentions so much in a few verses, a leading city, a Rome. This is going to be very important. Then we know Philippi is a Roman colony because Paul's going to lay claim to his Roman citizenship while he's there. It's going to be a major plot line. Verse 13, on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to a river, not to a synagogue. There's no recorded Jewish synagogue in Philippi. That would be the typical mode of operation. They would go to the synagogue, present the gospel first to the Jews. There's no recorded synagogue in Philippi. So they go outside the gates, where we supposed there would be a place of prayer, and we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. No men mentioned. And a certain woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabric, a worshiper of God, was listening. So we meet a woman named Lydia from Thyatira. Now, Thyatira is a city in Asia Minor. Thyatira is where Paul and Silas were trying to go, in the region of Lydia. So we're not really sure if we have this woman's name, if her name has just been taken from the region she's from, Lydia, or if she's just kind of known as the Lydian, the woman from Lydia. She's the Missourian or the Kansan. She's a foreign Gentile businesswoman. We don't know a whole lot about her, except that she's from where Paul and Silas had been trying to go. They were trying to get in that area of Asia Minor, and the Spirit of God had prohibited them, the first part of the book. And now they meet a woman from that area, and she's there with another group of women, and she is a worshiper of God. That's a technical term for Gentile God-fearers. They weren't Jews. They didn't have the law and the prophets. They didn't grow up with these traditions. But something has compelled her to seek after God, and she's gathered with a group of other women to pray and to seek after God, whatever that means to them. She was listening, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household had been baptized, with the understanding they all believed, she urged us, saying, "If you've judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay," and she prevailed upon us. We learn quite a bit from these few brief words in the passage. Can I just point out something we don't see here, just in case we were getting accustomed to it in Acts, and Peter had gone to Cornelius, and now the Gentiles are part of this, and then when the gospel had gone to other Gentiles, they spoke in tongues and prophesied, and it was a clear sign that the Spirit had come upon them. Here we have another Gentile group of people. We have Lydia, and seemingly her whole household, her servants, the people who work for her, they all become believers, and they're all baptized. And there's no indication that there was a miraculous sign gifting of tongues or prophecy, and that's how we knew that she believed and was baptized. And they're now part of a new church, part of the family of God. There's no indication that had to be accompanied by these other signs. They seem to be for certain signs where there was a Jewish population to confirm that God's covenant was now extended to the Gentiles. We don't read about it here. We're not going to make a big deal out of what's not here. But it is interesting to note, for someone who said, no, every time a person believes, this has to happen. Well, there's no record of it here, so it seems like it was not something significant that Luke was dwelling on. But we find that a new church has begun. Now, we said there's these words and these map kind of things. This has been the background all along for our study of Acts, this part of the world. I'm just kind of pinpointing now a certain area that we're in. Asia Minor is to the right side of that box. Europe, Philippi are to the left side of that box. We're going to zoom in a little bit and kind of just show part of the area we're looking at. You're like, I can't read that. Let me zoom it out a little bit more. They were in Troas. That's still considered Asia. And that's where they had the Macedonian vision. A certain man, a known man who was clearly from Macedonia appeared and said, come help us. So it says there, in verse 11, we ran straight course to Samothrace. Well, that's the island. That's a one-day journey from Troas, and very normal. You stop overnight, then you reload that ship, and you go on to Philippi, or actually the port city of Neapolis, and then up the road a little bit to Philippi. So what Luke is describing is very normal. If you were going to go from the mainland of Asia over to the European continent, this was one of the very common ways to do it, to sail from Troas to Samothrace, and the next day on to Neapolis, and from there, just to walk up the road to the inland city of Philippi. So that's what they do. That's where we are on our map. So a question we might ask is, we see, who started the church in Philippi? Well, the easy answer is the evangelists. The ones who went there to plant a church, the evangelists. And who are the evangelists? Who shared the gospel to start a church? Clearly, Paul and Silas. They're the ones who formed this missionary journey. They've been set apart. They've been sent. They've been months on the road. God has finally led them to the city where he has revealed for them to go. So Paul and Silas are there. But Timothy's also there. Timothy joined them on the trip. We saw the record of him and who he was and where he was, and so he's part of founding the church at Philippi. He'll come back up in the book of Philippians where Paul says, I'm hoping to send Timothy to you shortly. Why? Because they know Timothy. He was there at the beginning. He's part of the church plant in Philippi. Who else was one of the evangelists? Luke. Luke has joined them. At the end of the paragraph with verse 10, they saw the vision when we sought to go to Macedonia. We concluded God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Luke is now with them, traveling with them. Met them in Troas. You say, well, how do we know Luke was an evangelist? He wrote one of the Gospels. We call them the evangelists, those who wrote the Gospels. So Luke is literally one who God uses to relay the story of Jesus and his life and his works and his words, his death, his resurrection. And Luke is amongst the group now. Luke doesn't introduce himself. Luke, all of a sudden, it's like Paul had the vision, and then we concluded God was calling us to Macedonia. So we said, where does he come from? Where does he go? Nobody knows. Cotton-eyed Luke, right? Okay, I know. You were singing it. I saw it. So Ernst Hainchen, who writes Acts of the Apostles, one of the well-known commentators, says, a long list of investigators has concluded from the passage, Luke, the physician, and we know he's a physician. We read about that later. He must have met Paul in Troas. Luke was there. Why was he in Troas? Where is he from? We don't get all the details yet, but something had led him to Troas, and he was there. Now, I mentioned this briefly last week. Let me just show you where I'm getting some of this from. G. Campbell Morgan, in his commentary, says, I sometimes wonder whether Luke wasn't the man of Macedonia, the one in the vision, whether he didn't come to call and ask that he would join him. Perchance the vision of the night was granted to this man at Troy, to Paul, and then came Luke, the actual man. Now the whole journey is explained. Now the new door is opened. Sir William Ramsay is known as one of the great historians on Paul and Luke and the veracity of Luke in Acts and Paul's travels. He was the professor of classical archaeology for many years at Oxford University before he headed the classics department at Aberdeen. He says, there was therefore only one way in which Paul could know the man by sight to be a Macedonian. The man in the dream was personally known to Paul. And in fact, the Greek implies it was a certain definite person, because it doesn't just say a man from Macedonia, it says a particular man of Macedonia who appeared. In the vision then, a certain Macedonian who was personally known to Paul appeared in the vision and called him Macedonia. It's been generally recognized Luke must have had some connection with the city of Philippi. We find reason to think he had personal knowledge of the city. So the idea suggests itself at once that Luke himself was the man seen in the vision. And when one reads the paragraph of that idea, it requires new meaning and increased beauty. Now, I'm not saying this is something that we're going to hold to as dogma, that Luke's the Macedonian man in the vision, and Paul knew him. Paul probably sought medical treatment from him in Troas. We know that Paul had been sick on the road because we write later to the Galatians. We know he was in need of medical attention. We don't have all the details. I wish we did. I can kind of surmise that Luke is a certain Macedonian man who's familiar with the territory, and then he just is there the next day and concludes God has called us now to Macedonia. But Luke is now with the group, and Luke is part of the evangelists, and Luke is going to give eyewitness testimony now in Philippi of what happened. And then it seems Luke's going to stay in Philippi when the rest of the group goes on to Thessalonica, and we're going to find later sections in Acts where it's they went here and they went there and they went there. Then we sailed, and it's like Luke is back all of a sudden. Luke's traveling with them again, but he stays in different cities and continues the work of the gospel while Paul and Silas go on elsewhere. And we'll find him like that over the next 20 years of history in the story of Acts. So who started the church in Philippi? The evangelist started the church in Philippi. But couldn't we actually say it was Lydia that started the church in Philippi? I mean, she's already there with a group of women. They're already seeking after God. They're the ones who are already praying that God would do something. And it says that Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabric, a worshiper of God, was listening. The Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household had been baptized, she's the first converts in the entire European continent. She's the first convert outside of that locale where we began, first in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then still in the continent of Asia, and still in those Roman provinces distant. Lydia is now the first one to hear, respond to the gospel in all of Europe. We might say she's responsible for the spread of the gospel in Europe, responsible for the Protestant Reformation that will come out of Europe, responsible for the founding of the great denominations in Europe. Lydia's the first. And she says, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. She has amazing humility and amazing generosity. She evidently has a house large enough, not only for a household of servants, but now to house Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke and others who may be with the traveling party. And evidently, later we'll find out in the letter, house them comfortably and care for them and then support them and meet their needs. So Lydia is sort of the one who starts the church in Philippi. We'll find at the end of the chapter, after Paul and Silas leave prison, verse 40, they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia and saw the brethren, meaning the church is gathered in Lydia's house. The church meets in Lydia's house. So we can say Lydia is responsible for starting the church in Philippi. But lest we forget, isn't God responsible for starting the church in Philippi? And here's this amazing section of verse 14. A certain woman named Lydia was there. She was a worshiper of God. She was listening. She was seeking. She was actively listening. And the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. I will submit that without God opening her heart, she would not have believed. For only those whom he draws can respond. And now all of a sudden we're finding God had to be the one to start the church in Philippi because Timothy, Luke, Paul, Silas in their own effort could do nothing. The first paragraphs of the chapter showed us that. It wasn't their plan, it wasn't their strategy, it wasn't their plotting, it was God. And God had to open the heart of Lydia so that she could see. So now we're confronted by some challenges. Who's responsible for the church in Philippi? Not just responsible for its beginning. Who's responsible now for the ministry? How is the ministry to go on? How is the church to continue? The evangelists. Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke. Paul's going to write letters back to the church over the years to support them and strengthen them, give them direction, tell them how to act. One Lord, one faith, one baptism. Keep thinking of others as better than yourself. All these things that are going to come out of Philippians. Lydia is responsible for the church in Philippi. She's its founding member. It meets in her household. She's going to be responsible for how the ministry gets carried on, for how things take place in Philippi. But God is responsible for the church in Philippi. Because the same way where Paul says, you need to think this way, you need to be of one mind, you need to be of one thought, and you need to think of others as better than yourselves, you need to humble yourselves and watch out for the circumcision and watch out for the dangers. He begins that letter in chapter 1, verse 6 of Philippians saying, he who began the good work in you is the one who will be faithful to complete it until the day of Christ. God began the work, and God's going to... Wow. So Dan, what are you saying? Who's ultimately responsible? D, all the above. Well, was it more on us or more on God? And here's the challenge we find in these verses, and one that we should grapple with as Grace Fellowship Evangelical Free Church. And here's one of our favorite words, this antinomy. If you were in Sunday school last week, the 7 of you who were there, thank you. Time changed Sunday. It was early. Some were traveling. This antinomy, this struggle, the word meaning anti-law. It's against the laws of reason. Well, I thought Paul started the church in Philippi. Well, Lydia started the church in Philippi. But if God hadn't opened her heart, there would be no church in Philippi. The antinomy is a contradiction between two beliefs or conclusions that in and of themselves are reasonable. God began the church in Philippi. Paul began the church in Philippi. Both statements are reasonable. Lydia began the church in Philippi. That's a reasonable contention, but we can't have them all. We have to give a little on one or the other. That's why it's antinomy, though. We don't give on any of it. They're all true. J.I. Packer's written a great little book called Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God, where he wrestles with this question. And this just bears seeing in length. God's sovereignty and man's responsibility are taught to us side by side in the same Bible. Sometimes indeed in the same text. Both are thus guaranteed to us by the same divine authority. Both, therefore, are true, God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. It follows they must be held together and not played off against each other. Man is a responsible moral agent, though he's also divinely controlled. Man is divinely controlled, though he's also a responsible moral agent. God's sovereignty is a reality, and man's responsibility is a reality too. This is the revealed antinomy in terms of which we have to do our thinking about evangelism. Let me just give you an example of what that looks like if you want to turn with me or just listen. John chapter 6. Jesus is speaking with the disciples and others gathered around about the blessing that he is bringing about salvation. They're just getting to understand that. And so in John chapter 6, I'll just start in verse 35. Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger. He who believes shall never thirst. Man is the responsible moral agent. But I say, you who have seen me and yet do not believe, all the Father gives me shall come to me. So it's all divinely controlled. The one who comes to me I will not cast out. I've come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me. Of all he has given me, I will lose nothing but raise it up on the last day. So it's all on God. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who beholds the Son of God and believes in him may have eternal life. So you are the responsible moral agent. And I myself will raise them up on the last day. Verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise them up on the last day. Verse 51, I am the living bread that came from heaven. Anyone who eats of this bread shall live forever. In the same passage, we've got this, God is divinely responsible, and he is called here. But anyone who comes and whosoever will may come and can listen. In the same passage, we have this struggle. Now, some of you are going, Dan, why are you bringing this up? Because it's there in Philippi. Romans 9 and 10 are also great examples of where in the same text, we kind of see this going back and forth. Just start with Romans 10. That's where it says, starting in verse 8, what does it say? The word is near you. The word is in your mouth, in your heart. The word of faith we're preaching. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, if you believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You're a responsible moral agent. You can respond to the gospel. For with the heart man believes, resulting in righteousness. With the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. Thus the scripture says, whosoever believes in him will not be disappointed. Everyone may come. There's no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call upon him. Whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Romans 10:13. And then our responsibility as a church, verse 14. How can they call upon him if they haven't believed? And how can they believe if they haven't heard? And how can they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? So we have a responsibility as a church to send missionaries. This is our mission month. We're sending people out in the world. Why? Because man has to respond and believe. He has to, in faith, accept the gift of Jesus Christ. His death, his burial, and resurrection. Man is a responsible moral agent, and whosoever will may come. We turn back a page to Romans chapter 9. What shall we say, verse 14? There's no injustice with God, is there? He said to Moses, I'll have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. The scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raise you up to demonstrate my power in you, and my name might be proclaimed throughout the earth. So he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. But I thought, whosoever will may come. I thought anyone could call on the name of the Lord. They can. But it all depends on God's sovereign plan. Yes, it does. Now you know why we call this antinomy. Two things that just don't seem like they can coexist and both be true. But here's the danger. We can't diminish one because we don't like it. We can't jettison the other because it makes this one difficult to hold on to. I know we like tidy theology, right? We like to clean everything up and have it nice and neat in a little system and a little box, but God will not be put in a box. And he sometimes declares things in the same text that are very difficult for us to understand. And so you might say, how can these both be? How could God find fault with those that he hasn't divinely chosen? Well, you need to recognize then you're in the company of the very next verse, because in Romans, Paul says, now imagine some of you are thinking, verse 19, you will say to me, how can God still find fault? Who could resist his will? And then Paul answers the question, but not at all in the way I want the answer. I want him to answer the question so I can understand it. Instead, Paul says, on the contrary, you're asking the wrong questions. Who could answer back to God? The thing molded cannot talk to the molder and say, why did you make me like this? Doesn't the potter have right over the clay to make from the same lump one for honorable use and one vessel for common use? What if God, though willing to demonstrate his wrath and make his power known, endured with much patience the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? It did so that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand. Paul says, here's the problem. When you start asking questions of the Creator, you got to recognize you're just a creature. And the creature has no right to condemn the Creator. And so we come to difficult passages. We come to a spot where Lydia was seeking after God, worshiping God, but she had not become a believer. We don't know how long she was there. These women are gathered outside the gates. It's known that they've done it for a while because somebody told Paul, it says, hey, there's a group of ladies who every Sabbath morning is out there. I think they pray or something. I don't know. I hear them singing sometime. Well, who are they worshiping? Who are they singing? Who are they seeking? They don't yet know God. They have not yet accepted his Son, Jesus Christ. And even when Paul and Silas come, I might have done that. I don't know. Even when Paul and Silas, it's time to turn the page. Even when Paul and Silas come, it doesn't say their words were so persuasive and trained in apologetics were they. She could not resist, but on her knees before them she fell. That's how you read about the Puritans, right? I mean, some of those like, their words were so powerful. And the Great Awakening, like, oh, they were such powerful preachers. People just fell on their knees before them. Lydia's there, she's open, she's seeking, she's listening, but God opened her heart. So the real question is, who's responsible for Grace Fellowship? Who's responsible for the ministry of the church? Who's responsible for what this church is and what this church does? Who's responsible for starting the church? Was it Jeff and Carol Sumi? Some of you knew that they were church planters who came to this city to plant an evangelical free church, and did. So are they now responsible for the church and what it does? Were they responsible for its beginning? Well, yeah. But no, but not exclusively. Was it some of the early members? Reddicops have been here a long time. Atwells, Nelsons, these Nelsons, not those. Some of y'all have been in this church 20, 30 some years, almost from the very beginning. I don't know, was anyone here who was from the very beginning? Some of you guys were, and then you guys went to St. Louis, then came back, and you guys were pretty early. So is it your responsibility, what this church is and what this church does? I mean, you were here kind of first. Lydia was first. She gets to decide. Because now Lydia's going to have to decide, oh, that Roman jailer we're going to find about in a couple of weeks, like he's a pagan Roman, but he and his household believed and were baptized. Am I going to let them into my church? My house? My church? Whose church is it? Is it all the current members, you and me? Are we responsible for the church? Or is it God who's responsible for the church? Is it all of the above? Well, do the Sumis still have some responsibility? I mean, they planted the church, but they left decades ago. What are we to do then? What's our responsibility? Romans seems to say we need to send, we need to evangelize. That's why we have Missions Month. Timothy Reddicopp, we discussed this morning, who grew up in this church and now is working with navigators on college campuses to what? To take the gospel, because how can they hear without a preacher? I mean, we're responsible to send him. Otherwise, people won't hear and they can't respond and they can't be saved. But I thought God already had that all chosen. Yes, both. But we have responsibility. So we have this divine will and this human responsibility. What are we going to do with it? J.I. Packer said, our speculations are not the measure of our God. I like that. Whatever you and I might speculate about this, that's not how we measure God. Whatever we decide about this tension, well, how much is on us, how much is on God? And people do, and people have, and books have been written on it, and denominations have been built and split over such things. About how much do we emphasize God's divine providence and will versus how much is man's responsibility, and there's still great tension over these things. Can I this morning just say there is one thing we can know without a doubt? One thing that seems so very, very, very clear throughout the Word of God, that you and I are responsible to pray for open doors for the gospel. We've talked a couple of times so far this year already about the need for prayer and this emphasis on prayer that we're seeing in Acts, that the churches are to be praying, that they're to be devoted to prayer, built on prayer, going out through prayer. In the midst of this, like, well, do we change God's mind? Do we assist? What is prayer? Throughout the book of Acts and throughout the letters of Paul, we're going to see the church is commanded, begged, pleaded with to pray for open doors for the gospel. Just a chapter or two ago in Acts 14:27, when they had finished their first missionary trip and they came back home to Antioch and give a report from it, it says, they there at Antioch, 14:27, reported what God had done with them and how God had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. God opened the door. In Philippi, God opened Lydia's heart. So we might be tempted to say, well, then it's all up to God. You haven't answered the question. But even though it is all up to God, it's also up to us, because Colossians 4, the reading we had earlier, and we've read it recently, we come back to it. Colossians 4, 2 and 3, devote yourselves to prayer. Church of God, devote yourselves to prayer. Keep alert in prayer. Have an attitude of thanksgiving in prayer, praying at the same time for us, the evangelist missionaries, that God may open to us a door for the word. Paul didn't say, so God will open doors wherever he wants to, and we'll just see what happens. He said, oh no, church, I beg you, I plead with you, I command you, be alert and vigilant in prayer that God would open doors, that God would give us an open door for the word, that we could speak the mystery of Christ and know how to speak it. That's a clear command to the church. 1 Corinthians ends by Paul talking about the ministry that they had and what was going on. We read these in Sunday school last week. I know most of you weren't there, and this is a repeat, but 1 Corinthians 16, 8 and 9. I'll remain in Ephesus for a while until Pentecost, because a wide door of effective service has opened to me. Church, pray for wide doors, pray for open doors. And where does Paul say? Where there's an open door for the ministry. Just a couple pages later, 2 Corinthians 2:12, in a letter written sometime later. Now when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, a door was opened for me in the Lord. This is a different visit to Troas. A door was open. First time they're in Troas, they didn't have an open door for ministry. They didn't even share and witness and minister there. They didn't found a church there. They had a vision to go somewhere else. But on another time, Paul said, then when we came back to Troas, an open door was given to us. Philippians 1 is where Paul is telling the church in Philippi, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I know this. Because of your prayers, the Spirit is going to lead. Because of your prayers, things are going to happen and will be delivered. Revelation 3:8, there's letters written to the churches, 7 churches. One of them's Thyatira, actually, but not this particular letter is to the church at Philadelphia. And God says this, I know your deeds. I have put before you an open door which no one can shut. You have a little power. You've kept my word. You've not denied my name. So I have put an open door before you that no one can shut. We are to pray for open doors. We're supporting missionaries. We're responsible to send them out, to give of our own finances, to be good stewards. God has entrusted much to us so that we can go out, and some of you will go out, and some of you go on missionary trips, go on evangelism trips. Many of us, most of us at this point are like, well, we can send others. Maybe God's provided a job for me so I can send others to go and support them, like Romans 10 said. Would you pray about that stewardship this month? Carefully, seriously? Would you devote yourselves to prayer Say, God, what is our family stewardship in this? You're going to have to do all the work. You're going to have to open the doors. But you've given us a stewardship as well. What are you asking us to give? What are you calling us to do as part of this? And then the missionaries that we have, we need to pray for. And we need to commit to praying for them often, praying for them diligently, praying for them well, and committing ourselves to prayer for them. And all the tensions that can be here, how churches actually start, how ministries actually take place. There are faithful people who go. There are faithful people who obey and end up in Philippi. They preach the gospel and preach it well. There are seekers who open themselves to the gospel and believe. There's God who opens the heart. I don't want to diminish any one of those factors.